My name is Frank McGilvery, and I've been an Alaska resident since June of 1960. I came to Alaska out of high school. I went to work for the Highway Department in Anchorage, Alaska, and in August of 1961 was transferred to Fairbanks, and I worked at the University of Alaska for the foundation section for the Highway Department. And we did foundation study for bridges and buildings all across the state of Alaska. And was this experience, our office was in the Duckering building, right down the hall from the engineering offices. And that's where I met Bill Mendenhall, Ed Rice, Hal Payton. And Hal Payton, as it turned out, was one of the big people involved on the pipeline. He had a PhD in ice mechanics. Anyhow, so I worked for the foundation section, and then after the earthquake, I transferred to Anchorage to work on reconstruction projects, highway reconstruction projects. And in 1968, the big Prudhoe Bay oil discovery was made, and that changed a lot of things in Alaska. Prudhoe Bay at that time had virtually no infrastructure. Most of the oil exploration activities were out of Sagwan, and they had an airstrip there, and the only way supplies got into Prudhoe Bay was barges once a year in the summer. They flew stuff into Sagwan, and Tennessee Miller had cat trains that came out of Fairbanks, actually out of Dunbar, the railroad siding on the Alaska Railroad, and they hauled stuff up to Sagwan. And so when they made the discovery, they were trying to figure out how to move the oil to market. And I don't know if you remember the Manhattan Icebreaker project they had, and that was to see if they could get tankers with ice-breaking ability to Prudhoe to haul the oil out. And it turned out that didn't work out. So the choice was either by air, and that wasn't a good choice. And so the last alternative was pipeline. And so in '69, they pretty much had the selections made that the pipeline would come down the Sag River, Saginaw River, to Sagwan, and then there would be one route that would go through Anatuvik Pass, which is a low pass through the Brooks Range, or Adigan Pass, which is 4,800 feet, and then down the Chandeleur Shelf and follow the Dietrich Middle Fork rivers. So in April of '69, they had 4 field crews that were selected to do these studies. And one crew was stationed at Sagwan, and they studied the route Sagwan down the Sag River, Adigan River to Adigan Pass. They had another crew that studied Sagwan through Anatuvik Pass, and I'm not sure where they met up with another crew that went from somewhere around the Yukon River north up towards Fish Creek. Fish Creek's approximate location of the Arctic Circle. The crew I was on worked out of Wiseman North and Coldfoot in that area. So as it turned out, the selection was made that they would go the Adigan route, probably for a couple of reasons. Even though the elevations were higher, going cross country across the North Slope was materials. There was no infrastructure. They had to build a road and a work pad. And so the limited amount of gravel and materials probably is what made the final decision, not the elevation. So that was my involvement in the route selection studies, and I did that in the spring of '69. After that, all of the other things that happened, the environmental injunctions, the land claims issue, those type of issues came up. And in the fall of '69, they decided to do more studies, soil permafrost studies, and I was working for the highway department in Anchorage. I got a leave of absence. It was our slow period, and I went to work for R&M Consultants, and we were doing field studies in the Copper River Basin, and that was just the start of it. And as it turned out, these studies continued on until right up till about the pipeline was approved. And during that process, I moved from Anchorage back to Fairbanks in 1971. And part of the job we did, we went to Houston, where the pipeline operation was based out of. And I went on a 30-day in Houston, 30-day back to Fairbanks basis. And we had R&M had a small office at their pipeline headquarters in Houston. And so anyhow, I did all this pre-construction stuff, and there were a lot of things that I remember about the pre-construction. One of them in particular was Pump Station 7 was located north of Globe Creek on Grapefruit Rocks. And there were some hikers and rock climbers that said, you can't put a pump station here. It's going to interfere with our rock climbing and so forth. So the pump station was moved a little bit further north, and actually it's almost near milepost 400, it's just north of Pump 7. So that was one of the things I remembered. And I can remember the other issue that came up during all these design things was the Nelchina caribou herd. And Ken Robertson was the biologist who was a state authority on the Nelchina herd. He was based out of Glen Allen. He maintained the caribou wouldn't cross under an elevated pipeline. So they ended up building 2 sections of refrigerated buried pipeline just south of Hogan Hill, between Hogan Hill and the crossing at the Gulkana River. So they had 2 buildings, MLR1, Mainline Refrigeration Unit 1, Mainline Refrigeration 2, and they had refrigerated lines underneath the pipeline to keep the soils frozen. And there were 2 sections. There's some other stories about those mainline refrigerated. Anyhow, the other thing about the Gulkana River crossing, because of a problem, a land dispute, some problem, right immediately before construction, there had been a buried crossing of the Gulkana, and at the last minute, they had to change the location of the crossing, and it proved to be an elevated crossing. And there was an engineer by the name of Dennis Nottingham who designed the pipe crossing over the Gulkana with materials that Alyeska had on hand for the construction of the pipeline. And Dennis Nottingham, I may add, for a couple other things. One, during construction, he's the guy that designed the tram that lowered the pipe at Thompson Pass. And if you've ever seen any movies of the construction of Thompson Pass, that was pretty amazing. He was working for the highway when they built the Yukon River Bridge. And it has the pipe racks on both the upstream and downstream side. He was the state bridge designer of that particular bridge. Anyhow, he eventually came to work for R&M, and that was his involvement in the pipeline. So I wanted to talk about, so anyhow, when the pipeline construction actually started, I was on loan from Alyeska, from R&M to Alyeska, Construction Section 3. And Construction Section 3 was from the Yukon River to the Salter River. There were 6 original construction sections. One was down at the area north of the terminal. One was delta down towards the Gulkana Copper River area. Then there was one section from Pump 6 north, and there were 2 sections. One was over the pass and one was the north slope. Not sure the boundaries of those right now. Well, anyhow, I was on loan. At that time, Bechtel was a construction management contractor. And as it turned out, things weren't going real well. So Alyeska decided to take over the complete management of the pipeline. And Ben Anderson was a construction manager for Section 3. He's the guy I was working for. So when Alyeska took it over, there were only 5 or 6 of us on the staff, on Ben's staff. So they expanded, and he had a construction staff, and then they started a field engineering section. And Fred Pfeiffer was the field engineering supervisor in Section 3. I was the geotechnical supervisor. I had the above ground engineers, below ground engineers, the Arctic civil engineers. And when Fred was away, I was the acting field engineer and supervisor. Okay, having said all that, a lot of interesting things happened during the pipeline. One of the things that we were involved in are what they call DCRs, design change request. If you saw something that would change the design, either change it from above ground or below ground or whatever, then you put in this request, which was reviewed by engineering and Anchorage and so forth. And one of the things that we did, we discovered that the above ground crossing on the Hall Road just south of Isom Creek didn't have to be an above ground crossing. It could actually be buried. And that was a big ticket item. Jim McPhail, who was head of the engineering, I think he was a PhD, he said when they saw that notice, he said, we sat up and looked at it. He said, and it did, it changed. So that was one of the big things we put in. There were a lot of small design change requests. And the other thing that we were involved in, they had QC reports and irregularity reports. And so we had to review those in the field to see if we could resolve the issue. And we had a lot of those. So that's basically what our responsibility. We had some above ground engineers from Dames and Moore. I don't remember if Woodward Clyde, they were consulting firms, was involved in the above ground or below ground, but those were consulting groups that were hired by Alyeska to assist with the construction. So we went through all the construction and everything, and then after construction, I was recruited by Fred Pfeiffer, who was my immediate supervisor in field engineering, to go to work for Alyeska. And they started out with the construction of the pipeline sections. They had the southern, central, and northern districts. And so I was in the central district. I was at Gate 22. The central district headquarters were Gate 21. And that's when Pump Station 8 blew during oil in. And I was at Gate 22 at that time. So after the explosion and all the modifications, they ended up deciding to build a contingency pump station, and that was Pump Station 2. that had not been scheduled to be built in the original construction. So it was pump 1, 3, 4, 5 was not a station with mainline units. It had a pig trap, and it had storage tanks and injection pumps. Then pump 6 was on the Yukon, on the south side of the Yukon. Pump 7 was under construction because the price of crude oil was high. Pump 8 was down by Johnson Road. 9 was in Delta. 10 was in Isabel Pass. And pump 6, 8, and 10 had topping units. That made the fuel to fuel all the pump stations south of the Brooks Range. Everything north of the Brooks Range was on natural gas, which proved to be created the least maintenance of all the pump stations. It was really good. So pump 11 was never built as a pump station. It was mostly instrumentation. And then pump 12 pushed the oil over Thompson Pass. So anyhow, it wasn't, I was still at gate 22 in I'm trying to think if it was 1970, no, 1980. Can't think of the year. Early 80s, there was an explosion at Steel Creek. Anyhow, so there were 3 of us, John Globig, Bob Goodwin, and myself, went out. There had been a report from FAA that there was steam coming out of the pipeline at Petey Road. So we drove to Petey Road. We were just about ready to get on the pipeline, and they said, no, it's north of the Chena, just north of gate valve 73, RGV 73. So we drove up, and we found oil spraying out of the pipeline down at an angle. So we walked up, and I found a fuse, which was used for the explosive device. We called in, activated the oil spill response team, and they got out there pretty fast. And that was my involvement in that particular situation. There had been another explosion, not publicized very much. Someone had taken some sticks of dynamite, put them on a pipeline shoe at Treasure Creek, and blew up the pipeline. All it did was it blew the sheet metal and insulation off the pipe, and it damaged the pipeline shoe, which was the only thing that had to be replaced other than the insulation and sheet metal. The other incident of sabotage was a bullet hole out at Treasure Creek. And security reported that there was a hole in the insulation. There were 2 holes in the insulation, and they were only about a couple inches apart. So I was stationed at Pump 8 at the time. So we drove to Engineer Creek, cut the sheet metal and insulation, and there was a hole in the pipe that had been, the bullet had pushed the pipe in about 3/8 of an inch and had ricocheted back, coming out that it was almost a dead center. Just a little bit more, we'd have had an oil spill like they did at the Tolovana River. So anyhow, we put a BP bullet clamp on it, which is a temporary clamp with a big rubber gasket, and you tighten it up. And the other thing we did is there was a pig in the line, and we called Valdez Control Center, had them hold the pig at Pump 6, so that there's a possibility the pig could have knocked that little plug out. So we spent the night welding a repair sleeve on the pipeline. So if you ever go out to the pipeline pullout there at Engineer Creek, if you know where it is. By the way, my counterpart, Dave Holland, who was on the other shift, and I built that pullout there, and the information sign and all that. So if you look at the pipeline, there's a milepost marker right there. And between that pullout and the transition and the check valve, there's a place in the pipe where normally you had the sheet metal and an expansion joint between each set of VSMs. There's a place you'll see a different repair had been made. So that's always interesting. The other thing we did, and I don't know how visible it is now, there was a crew that started at Prudhoe, and on they have a milepost marker every 1 mile in the below ground pipe, every 2 miles in the above ground. So they started stenciling a number on each VSM, and that's a number of feet from Prudhoe to that location. So each VSM you could identify right where you were. And if you ever go out to the pullout and take a look on the bracket that holds the shoe, I think that's where they stenciled that number. And if you divide it by 5,280, that'll give you the milepost that you're at. The other things we did at Pump 8, we had a baseline crew, had an operator, teamster, and laborer. Every pump station had those. At Pump 8, we also had a couple of other things. We had a tire man who worked the entire district doing tire repairs, changing tires, all that kind of stuff. We also had a porta potty guy. Jerry Crow was the guy that was there most of the time, that would service the porta potties. And you wonder, why are there porta potties after construction? Well, they had a porta potty at 5 Mile Airport, which is a permanent Alyeska, and a porta potty at Prospect Airport, Galbraith Airport. And they also had porta potties on any project. There's a lot of projects that they had, right-of-way projects or even projects in pump station where they had porta potties for the workers. So he worked out of Pump 8. So that's kind of the shift we had. And then in the early 80s, I can't remember exactly what year it was, they transferred everybody around. They always move things around. When they did away with the Southern District, they had the Northern District and the Southern District, and eventually they went to one district. So which they worked out, okay. So I went to Pump 5, and I was in charge of the Prospect Airport. And we had maintenance. We also, whenever we had a crew change plane in, we had the ARF, the Airport Rescue Firefighters. We had a fire truck there and trained crew that go to the airport for the crew change plane. The other thing we got, the FAA used to send us NOTAM, Notice to Airmen. I don't know if you ever heard of them. They send them to all locations. They warn you about flight restricted areas that have been added, maybe some construction where they're going to have explosives, those type of things. So as the NOTAM, last year, the government decided to change it because it isn't politically correct, to NOTAP, Notice to Air Personnel. So that was one of the things that happened. Anyhow, the other thing that, let's see if I want to get into. Oh, one of the things during construction too, if I can back up, is that the pipeline crossing of the Tolovana River It was originally scheduled for just a 60-foot standard pipeline crossing. However, because the crossing was skewed and some of the VSMs fell in the river, we made it a longer span, and the pipe that was there was originally 562 wall X65 steel, so it went to X70 562 wall because of the longer span. And the grade of steel, they had two wall thicknesses, 462, 562, three grade of steel, X65, X60, and X70. X70, 562 wall were the strongest pipe. And that's what they use on the discharge side of the pump stations, because that's where your high pressure is. Well, that's what they use for the crossing over the Tolovana, because it's a little bit longer span. That was one of the things I remember. The other thing, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. Frank Moulin was a construction manager. And there's a video of the pipeline construction, and he talks about the pipeline 799 miles. And everybody says, well, the pipeline's 800 miles. 800-mile marker is just outside the fence at the terminal down in Valdez. Well, the reason there's a little bit of a discrepancy, the pipeline contract, pipeline labor agreement, PLA, between the welders, operators, teamsters, and laborers, was for the pipeline, not pump stations or terminals. Those were separate contracts. So the pipeline construction, 799 miles, was on each station there's isolation valves. So, for example, at pump 8 they have an 8 SS and an 8 DS, 8 suction side, 8 discharge side. The pipeline on the upstream side stopped at the flange of 8 SS, and it started again on the flange on the discharge side of 8 SS. So the 11 pump stations, there's a little bit of footage, and it comes to approximately about a mile when you add it all up. So that was the difference. And the other thing that I got involved in, I was at Pump 5 when the Exxon Valdez on Good Friday, another Good Friday incident, happened. And then after that oil spill and all that, I was one of the two guys, Ron Miller and I, were selected to do the oil spill contingency plan. So our involvement was getting materials put together and staged at the pump stations in addition to what was already there. And they had meetings in Anchorage every week with government agencies and so forth. And so I was involved in that. The other thing I didn't mention was the oversight on the pipeline was the AO, the authorized officer. Each construction section had an AOFR, authorized officer's field representative. The guy in Section 3 was Ralph Brendel, and he had one guy, John Santora, that was his assistant, and they also had a staff that came out of Anchorage whenever they needed help. Well, maybe some of the design changes we had during construction, particularly the road crossing, I think that probably proud of the crew, the workers that we had. They really were good workers, and it was a composite crew, and they did jobs. They helped each other. There wasn't any of the bickering about whose job it was. Before construction, one of the things that happened was when they were doing the VSMs, there was a leveling device on the crane that lifted the VSM in place. And the pipe fitters said, no, leveling the pipe, plumbing the pipe, it's our job. So that was one of the things I remember too. There were a lot of issues like that. There was a lot of animosity, I think, between the Teamsters and the welders. One of the things, there was on the road between Live and Good and the Yukon, there was a cross, and it had a welder's helmet on it, and the sign said, here lies a welder, he talks smart to a Teamster or something. He talked back to a Teamster. That was one of the things. The other thing I can remember, before pipeline, we were at RGV 72, there were a lot of tests going on. They had some of the cross beams that the Japanese had were conducting a paint test on some of this stuff. Also, we were putting thermistors in the ground temperature readings for that was another thing we did. We monitored the ground temperatures. They'd have a thermocouple down alongside of VSM so we could monitor the ground temperature. So anyhow, I wasn't there, but Jim Movius, who worked for R&M, was there. And they were putting plastic tubing in the ground with the instrumentation. And one of the welders or pipe fitter, I guess the pipe fitter was there, came up and said to Jim, you can't do that, that's pipe fitter's work. And Jim said, no, it's part of engineering work. Well, the guy got a little upset about it. And Jim, I don't know if you knew him or not, Movius, he had an electrical engineering degree and a law degree. So he just stood back and said, go ahead and hit me. He said, hit me every dollar you can afford. And that ended that right there. So those are some of my recollections. And I'll probably think of a lot more afterwards, but those are some of them. Well, I've got a lot of concern about the government and the green policies. You know, I think maybe someday we'll all be able to depend on solar or wind or hydro. I think everybody shortchanges hydro. I went through Hoover Dam. It's amazing. I've always been a big proponent of the Susitna Dam project. I knew a guy, R.V. Hasty, who worked for the Bureau of Reclamation in the 1950s, and they did core drilling on dam sites. He worked on the Devil's Canyon project on the Susitna River in the 1950s, which would be an ideal location. And in those days, the big thing was the Yukon River Dam. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a project supposedly to dam up the Yukon at Rampart Canyon and supply electricity for the state of Alaska. And that had a lot of opposition, mostly outside. Fairbanks, Alaska was really in favor of it, but the amount of people that were in the state at the time, that was a heck of a project for that few people. Something like Susitna Dam would have been ideal. It still would be ideal because it's centered between the main population centers in the state. So all the solar and wind projects, GVA has gotten a little more green, and Eva Creek, the wind only is working those turbines about a third of the time. And in the winter time in Fairbanks, with less than 4 hours of possible sunshine, solar doesn't look like a good option. So I think we're going to be, natural gas would be great. My experience with the gas turbines on the North Slope and the oil turbines south, there's no comparison. No, but I've been up and down most of the pipeline. I worked on peg chases. I don't know if you know much about that or not. Well, peg chases, they have different types of pigs. They have the cleaning or scraper pigs, which basically is to remove wax out of the pipeline. Then they have the caliper pig, which records any abnormalities out around or any dents in the pipeline, that type of thing. And then they have the corrosion pig, which the Japanese developed, which measures wall thickness, and you can pick up if there's any corrosion taking place. So the scraper pig, they can run those through the line without any problem. The instrumented pigs, the corrosion pig, the caliper pig, they need to have the clappers and the check valve raised up into the bonnet so when the pig goes through it doesn't slam that big steel mass. So on a pig chase, what you do, you go down ahead of the pig, raise the clapper up, and then close it behind the pig. And we used to hate those because you go 24 hours a day and you didn't get much rest. The other thing about them, to raise the clapper up into the bonnet, you got to hand crank the valve. The grow valves are 45 revolutions to get it up in the bonnet. And you record how much in case you have to make a repair on the operator. So the grows were 45, WKMs were 110, average about. Then there was another valve, I forgot to mention, that was added right before construction, and it's down south of Willow Mountain. It's it's got initials. I can't remember what it is now, but you know, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, that's a left-handed valve. That's the only one on the pipeline that's completely different. And the only reason they didn't go with Grove or WKM, they were already producing, couldn't do any more. You know, I'm not really up on it, but that's new tech stuff. The corrosion pig was something the Japanese developed, and I can remember when I was at Pump 5, they had a pig trap at Pump 5 and Pump 10. They eventually moved the pig trap up to Pump 4 because that was such a long run. But I remember the Japanese were there when they first started doing the corrosion, and they had their hard hats and their chin straps, and they were very, very good. I want to tell you one more story about when I was at Pump 10. I was stationed at Pump 10 for a year, and they had run a caliper pig through, and they detected just north of Fish Creek an out around pipe and also an indentation in the pipe a little bit further north of that. So we dug the pipe up, and there were river weights on the pipe. And what had happened when they put the river weights, they had not completely put the bedding up, and so the weight, those big concrete weights, were just sitting on top of the pipe, and the pipeline was ovaled out a little bit. So when we pulled the weights off, it popped right back in. The other thing, at a tie-in weld just north of that, there was an indentation in the pipe. Surveyors had measured it. And so when I came on shift, I went out to see this particular indentation. And when I got there, it didn't look like what they'd said it was, what the survey had said. So I had them resurvey it, and what happened is that pipe popped back to the original round pipe. It was just really amazing. And I don't know what the pressure there was, but it was just a little bit south of pump 10. So it's probably higher pressure there than it would be in a lot of places, you know. So anyhow, that's basically, I'm sure I'll think of more things later. Anyhow, thank you for listening.